What's up, guys? This is Alex Christopher with the Duran, and I have with me Mark Sloboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst via Moscow. And today we're going to be talking about the INF Treaty and the possibility for a new global security structure. Okay, Mark. So we had a lot of news last week on the INF Treaty and Trump saying that he will be pulling out of the INF Treaty. I'm not sure how definite that is, by the way, if there's been any progress on that front as far as pulling out of the treaty.
No, it hasn't actually issued a notice of withdrawal. No.
Okay. So we can assume that there may be some negotiations, and we do know from announcements last week that they will be meeting, Putin and Trump will be meeting on the sidelines of Paris, and they will have a more in-depth meeting at the G20 in Argentina. And I am positive that the INF discussion and negotiations will be on the table there. So what do you think of them meeting and discussing the INF? What do you foresee here? What's the U.S. position? I would really like you to get into the U.S. position, and then I would like you to get into the Russian position and kind of tell our viewers how you think this thing will hash out going forward.
Yeah, so they are definitely going to discuss this. As far as we know, when John Bolton, the U.S. National Security Advisor, the infamous neocon, visited Moscow, he did not issue to Russia a formal notice of withdrawal from the treaty. And even when that issue is noticed, there's a 6-month period before it is allowed to come into force by the terms of the treaty. So it hasn't been done yet, and Bolton has spoken publicly. And Bolton seems to be completely driving U.S. foreign policy, especially when it comes to agreements like this pulling out of the announced withdrawal of the INF Treaty and others. John Bolton, it's long been known, has a visceral hatred of treaties that tie what he views as tying the U.S. hands, including all of the nuclear strategic arms treaties, right? Now that this is one of the last two. And part of his mission, as he sees it, is to get the U.S. out of as many international treaties as possible. And he's already done that with the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the Iran nuclear deal. He's done it with the Iranian-U.S. Treaty on Amity and Friendship, which the U.S. just unilaterally pulled out of, and now with the INF Treaty as well. At least, that we're operating under that assumption because the U.S. has announced it. But he indicated that he wants to have conversations with Russia on the sidelines of these upcoming 2 international meetings about strategic matters, and that means specifically nuclear forces, and we can presume the INF, and China, which once again, it stresses every time Bolton or Trump has mentioned the withdrawal of the INF, they have always put the stress on China, which shows that they're actually far more focused in their motivation for withdrawing on this treaty on China than they are from any supposed violation of the treaty by Russia. They're using that as an excuse to pull out of the treaty. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the treaty itself, because it's pretty wonky. Right. So it was signed in 1987 by then U.S. President Gorbachev and the Soviet President Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. And it is a bilateral treaty that is only between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and Russia as the legal inheritor of the legacy of the Soviet Union. That treaty, with everything else internationally, was passed on to Russia. So between the U.S. and Russia, and no one else. And what the treaty does is it bans short and intermediate range ballistic missiles and their launchers, right? And which includes a range of it's 500 to 5,500 kilometers, which is roughly, I think, 310 to 3,400 miles. So it's short and intermediate. They call it the intermediate range, the INF treaty, but it's actually short and intermediate range. And it only bans land-based missiles. It does not ban air, sea, and drone-based missiles. And this becomes important. We'll come back to that later. The reason why it was signed, there's two reasons why it was signed. What led up to it was the deployment in Europe. You have to remember that at the time, Europe was divided between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And there were missiles, intermediate range, short range missiles, pointed right at each other, right? Minutes away. The U.S. was deploying the Pershing II, and Russia had the SS-20. And they were both considered accurate, reliable, dangerous missiles. The big problem with them, one is that it made Europe into a battleground, right? The Soviet Union and the U.S. would be duking it out with nuclear missiles in Europe against each other, right? And when I say Europe, that means also the European part of Russia for the purposes of this conversation, at least, right? Now, the U.S. originally proposed this treaty, according to people who were involved in the crafting, simply as a way to look good and embarrass the Soviet Union, because they never thought the Soviet Union would agree to the terms that they were issuing, because they were far too advantageous to the U.S. That's the way it was viewed then. That's the way it is still largely viewed by members of the strategic, community in D.C. now. At the time, when the treaty, Gorbachev came out of nowhere and said, "Let's do this," and the Soviet general military staff was like, "Are you nuts? Right? We don't want that." And Gorbachev,
why is it advantageous for the U.S. or why was it?
Okay, so for one thing, the number of missiles that were destroyed as a result of this treaty. The U.S. destroyed 846 missiles it had in Europe. The Soviet Union destroyed 1,840 some missiles that it had, right, within that category. The terms of the treaty do not affect sea and air-launched missiles. That it would be what most people know as U.S. cruise missiles, Tomahawks, and which are launched by sea and now even by air and by drone. It's possible now. The Soviet Union and Russia is a land power. Its naval forces, its air forces are smaller in comparison to the United States. Now, other than tips of Alaska and Vladivostok, because of the range of these missiles, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are not themselves threatened by each other's short and intermediate range missiles. They're largely out of range. It's only that short non-strategic area between eastern Siberia and Alaska, that would fall within the range of those missiles. So the U.S. pulling out of this treaty does not mean that Russian intermediate range missiles are going to be pointed at it, because they couldn't be. It falls outside the range. It doesn't affect them. In a way, what this treaty, pulling out of this treaty, actually does is it screws over Europe, which was one of the main reasons for signing it in the first place. They wanted to reduce Europe as a nuclear proxy battleground between the Soviet Union and the U.S. It was viewed as keeping the fight largely above between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So that geographic context and the idea of leaving Europe out of it was a big reason for this treaty. The other reason for this treaty was response time. Intermediate range missiles fired at each other could hit the other side, right? Meaning Moscow, when fired from Western Europe, and and vice versa, fired at Western Europe from Russia or Warsaw Pact countries at the time. You would have at most an 8 to 10 minute window from the time they were launched to the time they hit. And there was a lot of discussion in the Soviet Union then that there's these 7 Stalin area buildings that are landmarks of the Russian skyline. They're known as Stalin's sisters. They're kind of a a modernist Gothic architecture. You either love them or hate them. I don't have the one. And one of these seven sisters houses the foreign ministry. And the foreign ministry was discussing that people at the top of the building wouldn't reach the bunkers underneath the building using the elevators, or not many of them. If these missiles were launched, they wouldn't reach the bunkers before they impacted. So the response time was very short. Which also means that decision time was very short. And this is crucial because, we've had far more, what we've actually had is incidences where there were mistakes in the reading of data and interpretation that we believed that the other side was firing nuclear missiles. And several God-blessed people on both sides of the aisle reviewed and said, let's check this, and discovered that missiles really weren't fired. And there were a couple of people on both sides that prevented a mistaken data from launching World War III. All right. And so that's a big matter of this time. The more response time you have to analyze, before you must fire your missiles in response in order, to take out the other side if they fired first. So response time was a big consideration as well. The U.S. never thought the Soviet Union would sign it. They did. It was done. The Russian military wasn't happy. The Soviet military then at the time wasn't happy about it. The terms of the treaty greatly benefit the U.S., which is a marine expeditionary military-based country. The U.S. doesn't have enemies in Mexico or Canada or anyone who could fire land-based intermediate-range missiles, which is all this treaty bans. Russia's naval forces, the Soviet Union, have always been insignificant compared to the U.S. And they, at the time of the treaty, they didn't even have the capability to launch these sea-based cruise missiles. Now, obviously, Russia does. They've got this Caliber cruise missile, which they launched to great effect several times now in Syria. And they've demonstrated the effectiveness. They've closed that technology gap, finally, and made several advances in other areas on what the U.S. has. So we come up today. Bolton hates these treaties. So he's got a more personal motivation there, and everyone agrees that Bolton is the one driving this. But in today's world, we have different geopolitical realities and different technology. Technology has advanced well beyond the terms of this treaty. The fact that sea, air, and drone-launched missiles aren't a part of this treaty has left the purposes of it far behind. Plus, Europe is no longer a divided battleground between. Europe is almost entirely united on the Western side, the geopolitical side. So Russia doesn't have a concern now about protecting Europe. And it must be said that Trump doesn't have much of a concern of protecting Europe because he doesn't really like the European leaders very much. A big part of it being is they actively campaigned against him, which could be viewed as meddling in the U.S. election if there were other countries other than Europe. So again, this pulling out of the treaty, it was done without any consultation with the European leaders, with NATO leaders. They're not happy about this. It makes them it increases the potential for them to be a nuclear battleground again. Now, Russia is saying that the U.S. pulling out of this treaty is a unilaterally, U.S. once again breaking their international commitments and unilaterally pulling out of an international treaty, in this case, one of the architecture of the Cold War era, strategic restraint. And they say it will increase tensions and start a new arms race, and there's a lot of rhetoric coming from the Russian side. That's part of the game. Russia is not really upset about the U.S. pulling out of this treaty. For years now, ever since the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2001, and especially once they started deploying missile defense in Europe and Poland and Romania, but also South Korea, the United Kingdom, sea-based units, and so on, started layering missile defense around Russia. Russia has been quite clear that, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is really no longer in our interests. It probably, at least according to the Soviet military, wasn't in our interests at the time. It was really a completely one-sided treaty, is the way that's the way U.S. military people look at it. It was the most one-sided treaty in favor of the U.S. that was signed, on arms control between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It was kind of a gift from Gorbachev, a goodwill gift, if you look at it that way. Also, Sergei Ivanov, the former Russian Ministry of Defense before two ministries of defense before Shugo, repeatedly, when he talked to Rumsfeld, who was Bush's Secretary of Defense, he requested that both the U.S. and Russia announce that they're pulling out of the treaty together. They're just getting rid of it, a bilateral treaty together. Didn't convince them at the time. But fast forwarded a few years, and Trump and Bolton are more than willing to take the political heat for pulling out of it on their own. And as far as Russia is concerned, quietly behind closed doors, I believe they're actually quite happy to have the treaty gone. They're more than happy to have the U.S. take the political heat for unilaterally withdrawing out of it. Another reason is, other than the technology that's changed, is the geopolitical realities. The UK and France are not signatories to this treaty and more than capable of developing intermediate-range ballistic missiles on their own. So are South Korea and Japan, and most importantly, China. Some 90% of China's intermediate-range of China's missiles fall within this category. And the U.S. is very concerned about these missiles in what they view as an inevitable conflict with China in the Western Pacific, basically the South China Sea area, where they believe that they are going to be challenged, or they are, it's them going to the other side of the world. They're going to challenge China there. And they're very concerned about the number of missiles because, of course, this treaty bans ballistic missiles as well. And it's not restricted by geography. So the U.S. still isn't allowed to counter China with land-based missiles in the Pacific. So the U.S. has accused Russia of being in violation of the INF treaty by developing, and research is allowed, but development and deployment, production and deployment are not. So they say that they've developed a land-based version of their Caliber sea-launched cruise missile with the designation 9M729. And they say they've deployed it in one, possibly two places in southeastern Russia, well away from the things. Russia, on the other hand, has long accused the U.S. of being in violation of the treaty. They say that the anti-ballistic missile launchers that the U.S. has put in Eastern Europe and in Romania, they are Mark MK41 launchers, which are used as part of the Aegis anti-ballistic missile city on ship. They're called the Aegis Ashore System. At sea, they can also be used to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are intermediate-range sea-based missiles, right, which are not forbidden by the terms of the treaty. But both Russian engineers, and very quietly, I've heard the same thing from a U.S. assessment, that these launchers can be very quickly retrofitted to fire intermediate-range cruise missiles, fired from the land, which is a violation of the treaty, and already deployed very close to Russia's borders. Kind of an intermediate-range missile system that is in the guise of an anti-ballistic missile system that Russia is already upset about and doesn't want the INF for. And from my view, it appears that both sides actually are in material breach of the INF treaty in small ways. In small ways. There's a couple of other Russian reasons for it. The U.S. has also developed an intermediate range missile that it uses for testing its anti-ballistic missile defense on. And Russia's like, who do you think you're fooling? If you're using this missile, if you developed a test missile, you can easily develop a full capable missile, right, with that range. So both sides have accused each other of developing in small ways, not large-scale deployment. And both sides could, well, certainly the U.S., since they're the one unilaterally pulling out, could come to terms on this treaty if they wanted to, right? They could geographically restrict it to Europe, so both sides were capable of building intermediate-range missiles against China. They could renegotiate the treaty so that China, South Korea, Japan, the UK, France, India, maybe other major countries were pulled into the treaty. They could inspect each other's sites. The U.S. could check the range of this 9M72 mine missile and see whether it really violated the terms of the treaty, and Russia could inspect these launchers in Romania. A trade-off could be made between the two of them. But the U.S. obviously isn't interested in this because their primary concern here is not the pretext of Russian violations of the treaty, but what they view as a growing threat of China. And they want to have, because the treaty also bans conventional weapons as well as, ones equipped with a nuclear warhead, they want to have those missiles available for a conflict with China in the Pacific. That's probably, it's not their only concern, but it's probably their major concern. And Russia would like to have these intermediate range missiles as well. Russia is great friends, strategic allies with China now, but military thinks in terms of contingencies, and politics, geopolitics, they change. And of course, it's not only China. Russia could be far more concerned with Japan and disagreements on the Sakhalin Island, about the Kurils, the Kuril Island archipelago, which Russia inherited from the Soviet Union that they took during World War II, and Japan wants back. There's still disagreement there. Also, again, the United Kingdom and France are capable of developing these missiles. There's also the technology has changed, and that kind of gets rid of the concern about response time, because all sides, all the major powers, Russia, China, the US, the EU, India, are developing hypersonic missiles, right? Missiles that go really, really fast and can evade anti-ballistic missile defenses, which is exactly why Russia developed them. And Russia seems to have a slight leg up in this game, and they've already announced that they are deploying some of these missiles. And because they fly so very fast and hit their target, they're also capable of great maneuverability and redirection, the issue of response time is already moot because of the existence of these hypersonic missiles. So who cares if you have intermediate range? So that's another concern. So the geopolitics has changed. The technology has changed. This would actually be a great opportunity to forge a new treaty, a new, far more comprehensive treaty, because all of the Cold War era treaties are falling apart. The Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty and the NATO-Russia Founding Act are being completely violated, particularly by the West at this point, right? They're just being ignored. No one's pulled out of it, but this fiction of permanently deployed troops that rotate in and out and are always replaced in Poland and the Baltics, that's certainly in violation. The New START Treaty is due to expire in 2021, and Trump has indicated that he has no real desire to renegotiate an extension or a modification of the treaty. So, unfortunately, this treaty is kind of a relic of the Cold War here. Now, there's an excellent opportunity to create a new treaty that might include sea and air launched intermediate range missiles. It might include new technologies like hypersonic missiles. We could have a treaty for cyber warfare, a number of things, of new technological undersea drones, a whole host of new technological developments that don't fall within the old framework of rules that we have from the Cold War. Plus, we live in a multipolar world now of ballistic missiles, and Bolton has pointed this out, and he's absolutely correct. China the UK, France, India, Japan, South Korea, they aren't covered by this treaty. So it's kind of tying the hands of the US and Russia and not these other countries. But if you came together and created a real multipolar international arms treaty, I don't think Trump is the one to do that. I don't think he has the temperament for it. But he's not going to be around for very long, more than likely. And his, whoever follows him whenever might be more inclined, to do this. When Bolton came to Moscow, it was the initial greeting was caught on camera, and Putin quipped to him. He said, I know a little bit about your United States seal. And on your seal, you have an eagle. And on one side, he's holding 13 olive branches. And on the other side, he's holding 13 arrows. I said, so what's the problem? Has your eagle eaten all the olives and only has arrows left?
Yeah.
Bolton responded to him, well, I hope to address some of your concerns, but I didn't bring any more olives. And Putin just said, yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't think any renegotiation is coming soon, but it's possible.
Well,
and
that was where actually I wanted to go to end the segment, Mark, is to sum it up, it looks like even though these weapons may be irrelevant or may be a relic of the Cold War, at the end of the day, Russia did not get hurt. The U.S. did not get hurt. It's actually Europe that's kind of getting screwed. If you had to choose someone that got the short end of the stick, you would probably say Europe.
Yeah, I would probably say Europe. It was a big question. If the U.S. starts developing these missiles, and by the way, the last Pentagon budget, the National Defense Authorization Act, gave $25 million specifically to research the development of new land-based intermediate-range missiles. So they were already signaling then that they're moving beyond it. But the question is, where would the U.S. deploy them?
Well, where would they?
That's a question. Certainly, France and Germany don't have any desire to put new U.S. intermediate-range missiles on their territory, because that would then immediately be targeted by equivalents on the Russian side, and they'd be back to the same point. Poland, the Baltics, these are countries that have the temperament to consider it, but it's likely they'd be under a huge pressure from Germany, France, Italy, other European countries who would say, "Are you insane? Do you want Russian intermediate-range missiles pointed at us on a hair trigger?" Other question is in the Pacific, if the U.S. concern is really with China, Japan, Australia, Guam. Now, these are potentials. It's unlikely politically right now that Japan would host them, but Guam and Australia are probably real possibilities, which again indicates that the real concern and the focus where the U.S. is looking going forward is putting land-based missiles in the Pacific. It would free up some of their naval units so they don't have to worry about reliability of only the sea and air-launched intermediate-range missiles. And also there's a little bit of military budget and politicking going on, because the Army realizes that the wars of the future for the U.S., the big wars where the big money is going to be sea and air-based. That's what a Pacific War will be. And they want in on that little chunk of change and importance. So if land-based missiles become a reality in the Pacific, the Army is suddenly back in the game and can demand more in terms of a budget. Seems really venal, but that's the way the U.S. different military branch politicking, unfortunately, works.
Yeah, but and you mentioned earlier that Trump may not be the guy to negotiate this, but could we say that if Trump is ready to do it, and if he is equipped to do it, with Bolton by his side, Pompeo by his side, all these guys by his side, at the G20 in Argentina with Putin, may we perhaps be seeing at least the foundation being set for what you mentioned earlier, new security architecture, with China as well being brought in and other countries and other weapons brought into the fold? The foundations, the beginning of. Is it possible?
It's possible. And it's possible that this is an attempt, a clumsy attempt by the U.S. to try to judge a wedge between what is essentially becoming a Sino-Russian condominium, an alliance between Russia and China. And this might be a clumsy attempt. by the U.S. to say, hey, you could put missiles against China too. Or we could try to rope China, very unlikely considering the advantage they have in the Pacific with their missiles, to come into this treaty as well. 11 years ago, Russian leaders might have jumped at the idea of aligning with the U.S. against China. That horse is already gone. The U.S. has proven too many times since then, whether Democrat or Republican president, that they're not reliable, and they will always take advantage of any situation to push further east, to ring Russia in with systems. I think Russia and China, and I want to thank the U.S. for this, actually, because I think it's essential to Russia's security that it is aligned with China going forward, and that the West is not to be trusted. But this may be a belated attempt. Trump has talked to Mearsheimer, he has talked to Kissinger, and they both advocate kind of the reverse of the policy that Kissinger had in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that the U.S. seek to geopolitically balance by allying with Russia now against a growing power of China. But that particular horse has probably already left the barn, the stable, if you will. That it's probably far too late for that. But that may be what Trump's reason, the Trump administration, at least Trump, maybe not Bolton, he may not buy into this. His rationale for trying, however futilely, and they've actually gotten worse, to better relations with Russia. And this might be a kind of a last-ditch effort. I mean, if there's one place that Russia and the U.S. have always been able to talk, the Soviet Union before, if relations got really bad, is they could go back to the technical diplomacy of strategic arms. It's possible. That's kind of a best hope scenario for the U.S. Withdrawing from this treaty. That's what they're really pushing for. A new deal with Russia, a new strategic understanding with Russia, or perhaps even, the more ambitious new international multipolar strategic arms treaty. But if the real result is they're looking for strategic advantage with China, if it launches a new arms race, we've already been in a new arms race since the U.S. pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally in 2001. And these new hypersonic weapons, hypersonic glide vehicles, nuclear-powered missiles, all these new things that are in development are a clear indication that we've already that's already a moot concept. We're already in a new arms race anyway. And I don't think, preserving this treaty or not preserving it would limit that in the long run.
So at the end of the day, it doesn't really make that much of a difference, this INF treaty being pulled off the table.
Yeah.
We're on a path. We're on a path, and it doesn't look like it's going to turn.
You should have already been scared of the tensions between the U.S. and Russia and other great powers. You should not be brought to a panic by this being pulled out, by this being withdrawn, though. It doesn't change the equation that much. And like I said, for Russia, it might actually be to their strategic advantage.
All right. Mark Slobod, International Affairs and Security Analyst. Thank you once again via Moscow. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to make sure you get videos every time we push them out. And visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt to help support the Duran. And in the description box down below, you'll find links to our PayPal and Patreon page. Mark Slobod, thank you very much. Via Moscow. Thank you. Take care.